The marble spins again. Listen closely. This is Dead Air Theater. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time Phil Carraway stepped out of the cab, but the street still gleamed as though freshly varnished, each cobblestone catching the city's sodium light and bending it into elongated reflections. The driver waited, engine idling, watching Phil with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to ask questions about destinations that didn't look quite real. Phil adjusted his coat, checked his phone, then checked it again. This can't be right. Jack Denholm had already paid the fare. He stood on the curb with his hands in his pockets, perfectly at ease, the rain having never quite managed to touch him. His coat was charcoal gray, tailored within an inch of its life, the kind of garment that suggested its wearer had never worried about money and never would. It's right. You're just not used to places like this. Find it okay? Phil glanced at the building again. La Viande Noire was not loud about its existence. There were no neon signs, no menus posted in the window, no valet stand. Just a narrow frontage wedged between a shuttered antiques shop and a blank stone wall that might once have been a doorway. The name was etched into a pane of blackened glass so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The letters were elegant, old-fashioned, and faintly unsettling in their symmetry. Yeah, but I follow restaurants, Phil said. I follow chefs, openings, pop-ups. This city doesn't open a broom closet without a press release. Jack smiled faintly. You don't find this place, Phil. It finds you. Phil snorted. Well, that's not ominous at all. Jack stepped forward and pushed open the door. The hinges made no sound. The temperature changed immediately. Not colder or warmer, but still. The smell struck Phil next. Citrus and polish, candle wax and old paper, with something beneath it that reminded him vaguely of rain on stone. A man in a black suit glided toward them. He was tall and spare, his hair silvered at the temples, his posture immaculate. The suit he wore was darker than the room around him, an absence rather than a color. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange fullness, as though two identical voices had been layered perfectly atop one another. Mr. Denholm, the maitre d' said, inclining his head. Welcome back. Phil blinked. Jack inclined his head in return. Good evening. Your table is ready. The maitre d' turned, already moving, and they followed. The hallway they passed through was narrow, paneled in dark wood that drank in the light from discreet sconces. The carpet underfoot was thick, almost springy, and Phil had the odd impression that it muffled not just sound, but any careless thoughts might be swallowed before they could escape. The hum he heard then was very faint. Not voices exactly, more like resonance, a slow vibration that settled in the chest rather than the ears. Been here long? Phil asked, more to break the silence than from curiosity. Jack shrugged. Long enough. They emerged into the dining room, and Phil stopped short. It was magnificent. The space was cavernous without feeling vast, intimate without being cramped. Velvet drapes the color of dried wine framed arched windows. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like inverted flowers, each petal cradling a candle whose flame did not flicker. Tables were arranged with obsessive precision, their white linens unblemished, their settings gleaming. Every patron was impeccably dressed. Suits, evening gowns, jewelry that caught the light just so. The murmur of conversation was low and constant, like a tide pulling gently at the edges of the room. Jesus! How have I never heard of this place? Phil breathed. Jack's smile deepened, but he said nothing. They were led to a table near one of the windows. Phil glanced out instinctively and frowned. The street was gone. In its place was a stone courtyard lit by lanterns that swayed despite the absence of wind. The stonework looked ancient, worn smooth by centuries of passage. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, something darker pressed close, just beyond sight. Phil blinked and looked again. The street was back. Wet pavement, parked cars, normalcy. Get a grip, he told himself. After you, Jack said. Phil sat, smoothing his tie, acutely aware of the way his hands trembled. He blamed the cold. This meeting mattered. Not in the abstract way that most meetings did, but in the way that pressed down on the lungs and made sleep elusive. Jack Denholm was not just an investor. He was a force, a gatekeeper, a man whose interest could turn a struggling company into an acquisition target overnight. Phil had spent months chasing this moment. Jack removed his coat and draped it over the chair beside him. His cufflinks caught the light. Dark stones polished to a mirror sheen. For a moment, Phil thought the reflection within them moved independently of Jack's hands. "You look like you're waiting for a firing squad, Phil," Jack said mildly. "It's just a lot riding on this," Phil replied. Jack leaned back. "That's when deals get interesting." A waiter appeared, seemingly from nowhere. He was tall, pale, and perfectly proportioned, his movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed. His smile was flawless, his eyes unblinking. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I bring you something to drink?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Our usual." The waiter turned to Phil. "Same," Jack added. Phil opened his mouth to object and then closed it again. "Sure, why not?" The waiter inclined his head and vanished. Phil exhaled slowly. "You come here enough to have a usual?" "Often enough," Jack said. Phil studied him. "You've never mentioned it." "It never came up." They talked while they waited. At first, it was safe ground. Travel, the city, the latest absurd headline making the rounds in finance circles. Phil found himself relaxing despite the setting, buoyed by Jack's effortless charm. Then the conversation tilted, almost imperceptibly, toward business. Jack asked questions, not the obvious ones. He wanted to know about Phil's people, his risk tolerance, his appetite for growth versus control. He listened without interrupting, eyes intent, fingers steepled slightly on the table. Phil found himself talking more than he had planned. "This isn't just about scaling. It's about survival, about not being swallowed whole by the next wave." Jack nodded. "And if I told you I could make that worry disappear?" Phil hesitated. "I'd ask what it costs." Jack smiled approvingly. "Good answer." The waiter returned with the drinks. They were served in crystal glasses, heavier than expected. The liquid inside was dark, almost black. But when Phil tilted the glass, he saw hints of a deep red, even purple, catching the candlelight. And there, underneath Phil's glass, was a folded piece of paper. Phil stared. It was small, no bigger than a matchbook, its edges rough as though torn rather than cut. He looked up sharply, but the waiter was already stepping away, his back turned. "To opportunities." Jack lifted his glass. Phil forced a smile and raised his own. "To opportunities." The glasses touched, chiming softly. Phil took a sip. The taste was complex. Dry, then sweet, then something metallic at the back of the tongue. It lingered longer than it should have. He set the glass down again, his eyes drawn inexorably to the folded paper beneath it. "Everything okay?" Jack asked. Phil hesitated again. He glanced around. No one was looking at them. Conversations continued. Cutlery clinked softly. He slid the parchment out with one finger and unfolded it beneath the table. 2 words written in sharp, hurried strokes. "Leave now." His pulse spiked. He laughed, a short, brittle sound. "That's creative?" Jack leaned forward slightly. "What is?" Phil crumpled the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Probably some gimmick. This place seems, theatrical." Jack studied him for a long moment and then shrugged. "People do love their games, Phil." The conversation resumed, but something had shifted. The room felt closer. The hum beneath the noise grew louder and more insistent. Phil became acutely aware of the weight of the air, the way the candle flames burned without wavering. He glanced at the window again. The courtyard was there. He blinked hard. "Phil, focus," Jack said gently. Phil forced his gaze back to the table. "Sorry. Just atmosphere." Jack smiled, all warmth. "Give it time. You'll see." Somewhere nearby, an old man laughed, a deep, satisfied sound. Phil swallowed, his throat dry. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself this was just a business dinner. He told himself that he could not afford to walk away. In his pocket, the crumpled note seemed to pulse with a heat that had no right to be there. The chandeliers overhead swayed just slightly, and no one else seemed to notice. Phil did not remove the note from his pocket again. He was aware of it in the same way one is aware of a splinter beneath the skin. Not actively, but impossible to forget once noticed. Every shift in posture reminded him it was there, crumpled and warm, as though it retained some residue of the hand that had written it. Jack resumed speaking as though nothing had happened. "So," he said, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "Tell me, what do you think happens after acquisition?" Phil blinked. "After?" "Yes. Let's assume success. Full backing. My people step in, and your product gets the runway it deserves. What do you do next?" Phil hesitated. This was not a question most investors asked. It was too personal, too speculative. I, stabilize the team. I make sure no one gets burned. Then we grow. Carefully." Jack smiled faintly. "You're still thinking small." Phil bristled despite himself. "With respect, Jack, careful growth is what keeps companies alive. And ambition is what decides which ones deserve to be." The word deserve lingered between them, heavier than it should have been. Phil took another sip of his drink, hoping the taste would settle. It didn't. If anything, it seemed richer now, deeper, the flavors unfolding in slow, unsettling layers. He could feel it spreading warmth through his chest, loosening something behind his eyes. Around them, the restaurant breathed. That was the only word for it. The low murmur of voices rose and fell in unison, as though guided by some invisible conductor. Cutlery chimed softly, glasses touched. Somewhere farther back, a woman laughed, a light, delighted sound that ended just a fraction too abruptly. Phil shifted in his chair. "You all right?" Jack asked. "Yeah," Phil said automatically. This really is an impressive place." Jack followed his gaze around the room. "It does tend to have that effect." The waiter appeared again, silent as before. "May I refresh your drinks, gentlemen?" he asked. Jack nodded without looking up. "Please." Phil opened his mouth to decline, then thought better of it. Refusing now would feel rude, conspicuous. The waiter lifted Phil's glass. For a heartbeat, Phil's fingers tightened reflexively around the stem. The waiter paused, then smiled, unchanged and perfect, and gently pried the glass from his grip. When he set it back down moments later, the liquid inside looked darker than before, the surface catching the candlelight in strange, oily patterns. Phil glanced beneath it. Nothing. No note. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Still thinking about the future?" Jack asked. Phil nodded. "It's hard not to." "It's harder to survive it, Phil. Most people never even get the invitation." "Invitation?" "Metaphor, Phil." Before Phil could respond, a voice drifted over from the neighboring table. "Excuse me," it said. "I couldn't help overhearing." Phil turned. The speaker was an old man, perhaps in his 70s, dressed in a brown suit that might once have been fashionable. His hair was white and thin, his face lined deeply, but his eyes were sharp, bright with an alertness that didn't match the rest of him. "My apologies," the old man continued pleasantly. "But you mentioned the future. Always been fond of that word. Havelock, my name. Pleasure." Jack smiled at him. "Likewise. No apology necessary, Havelock." The old man beamed. "First time here?" Phil nodded. "Is it that obvious?" The old man chuckled. "Oh, yes. You have the look. Like someone who's just stepped into a photograph and hasn't quite decided whether to smile." Phil forced a laugh. "I suppose that's accurate." "I remember my first night here," the old man went on. "Feels like another lifetime. I was younger then. Nervous. Thought I'd made a terrible mistake." "And did you?" Phil asked, despite himself. The old man's smile softened. "Oh, quite the opposite." Jack watched the exchange with idle interest, swirling his drink. "I met my wife here," the old man said. "Eleanor. She ordered the lamb. Said it tasted like the first sin." He laughed. The sound was warm and genuine, and yet Phil felt a chill crawl up his spine. "That's quite a description," Phil said. "She had a way with words," the old man replied. "Still does, in a sense." "In a sense?" The old man's eyes flicked away briefly toward the kitchen doors, then back. "Oh, she hasn't gone far." Jack raised his glass slightly. "To Eleanor." The old man returned the gesture. "To Eleanor. And to staying." They drank. Phil noticed then that the old man's teeth, when he smiled, caught the light oddly. They weren't jagged or broken, just longer than he expected. He looked away, annoyed with himself. You're just imagining things. The waiter returned again, this time carrying a small tray. He placed a folded napkin on the table between Phil and Jack. Compliments of the house. Thank you. The waiter turned to leave. Wait, Phil said suddenly. The waiter stopped, still facing away. Yes, sir? Phil hesitated, and his heart was beating too fast. Do you do pranks here? Notes, that sort of thing? The waiter turned. Up close, his eyes were very dark, reflective almost. Phil could see himself in them, distorted slightly, as though viewed through thick glass. No, sir, we do not. He smiled, and then he was gone. Jack leaned back. You're wound tight, Phil. Loosen up. Phil swallowed. Someone left me a note. Jack raised an eyebrow. What kind of note? It told me to leave. Jack laughed, a smooth, genuine sound. That's it? That's it. Jack waved a dismissive hand. Probably some regular having a joke. This place attracts eccentrics. The old man nodded enthusiastically. Oh, absolutely. Eccentrics everywhere. Phil studied them both. Their ease unsettled him more than the note had. He unfolded the napkin, and another piece of paper slid out. His breath caught. Jack noticed immediately. Phil? Phil stared down at the words. Do not eat. Leave. His mouth went dry. Jack leaned forward. What does it say? Phil folded the note carefully this time, his hands steady through sheer effort. Nothing important. Jack studied him again for another long moment, and then smiled. Good, because the tasting menu is about to begin. As if summoned, the lights dimmed slightly. A hush rippled through the dining room, conversations lowering, chairs adjusting. The old man sighed contentedly. Ah, that'll be my favorite part. Phil felt suddenly, acutely, that he had made a mistake. Not by coming here, but by staying. Thank you for listening to Dead Air Theater. Today's episode, La Viande Noire, was written and produced by Edward Baker. If you liked the story, please consider following the show on Spotify or joining the Discord via the link tree in the description. Every listener helps me keep the stories coming. We'll see you next Saturday for part 2 of La Viande Noire.